Hi, my name is Lydia. Welcome to my channel, and thank you for clicking on this video. I will be talking about a true crime, the attack of two girls at Fremont Canyon Bridge in Casper, Wyoming in 1973. My sources for this true crime are linked in the description box below. The content warnings for this video involve the intimate assault of a crime and the death of a child. In my recounting of this crime, I mean no disrespect to any person mentioned, and it is my intent to relay this information for educational purposes and to give a voice to the voiceless. In the cold and dark early morning hours of Tuesday, September 25th, 1973, in Casper, Wyoming, two sisters were killed, but it took 19 years for one of them to die. Becky Thompson, age 18, and her half-sister, Amy Burridge, age 11, lived in a close-knit family neighborhood in the southern edge of the city of Casper, in a modest split-level single-family home on Glendale Avenue. They lived with their mother, Tony, and their stepfather, who often worked out of town. Life in the 1970s was a simpler time for the children and the teens living in Casper. There was no internet, cell phones, computers, or video games. In the summer, neighborhood kids rode their bicycles to friends' houses and played outside until their parents called them from down the block to come home. Unsupervised groups of kids playing at a local park was a normal sight, and the term helicopter parent just did not exist. Casper is the second largest city in Wyoming, located in the eastern central region of the state, at the foot of Casper Mountain and at the north end of the Laramie mountain range. If the name Laramie sounds familiar, that might be because it's the name of the town in which murder victim Matthew Shepard was beaten, tortured, and left to die. Matthew was also from the city of Casper, although he wouldn't be born until a few years later. Casper was nicknamed the Oil City and had a long history of oil boomtown and cowboy culture. Oil figured prominently in the city's history from the outset, first being discovered there in 1889, and Casper has featured an oil refinery ever since. At approximately 9 p.m. on Monday, September 24th, 1973, Becky Thompson and her sister Amy Burridge left their home in Becky's Ford station wagon and headed for the Thriftway convenience store located at 12th and Melrose Streets. Their purpose was to buy some groceries for their mother, although young Amy also planned to purchase some candy with some spare change she had jingling in her pocket. At 18, Becky Thompson was a pretty and popular teen with long chestnut brown hair who was looking forward to the end of her high school years and the beginning of college. She had plans for a bright future. Amy Burridge, Becky's 11-year-old half-sister, was a ball of energy and a tomboy with a kind heart. She loved Jolly Rancher candy and wore her hair in pigtails with ribbons that matched the color of her clothes. In her photos, you could see the spark of fun in her wide-set eyes and her broad smile. Amy's 6th grade school year had just begun, and she enjoyed recess more than being in the classroom. In the summer, she would often be found playing baseball in the neighborhood with the boys in the area, and she could also hold her own among the rough and tumble crowd. Out of any place she could be, Amy was happiest outside playing baseball, football, or volleyball with her many friends. At the Thriftway, Becky parked her station wagon and the girls entered the store. At almost the exact same time, another vehicle arrived and parked in the lot, a white Impala with two men inside. With their shopping finished, Becky and Amy left the store and returned to the Ford, where they found their right rear tire flat. Becky was particularly annoyed since she had just had this same tire recently repaired. Noticing the girls' distress, two male strangers approached the vehicle. The two men, both appearing in their 20s, stepped out of the white Chevy Impala. One was skinny with dark hair, and the other was kind of meaty and blonde. They offered to drive to a nearby gas station to see if the flat tire could be fixed right away. The two men seemed nice enough, and Becky accepted their offer. While the men left in the Impala, Becky sent Amy back into the store to call their mother to inform her of what had just happened. Within 5 minutes, the Impala had returned, and as it rolled into the parking lot, the men told Becky to get in so that she could drive with them to the local gas station. However, Becky didn't want to leave without Amy and retrieved her from inside the store. Back at the Impala, Becky hesitated, unsure if she and her sister should leave with these two strangers. In response, the skinny stranger, who called himself Kenny, stepped to Becky's side and pressed a knife suddenly against her ribs, telling her to get in the car. Glancing around the lot and seeing no one else, Becky and Amy climbed into the back seat, and the car roared off. Meanwhile, at home on Glendale Avenue, Tony, the girl's mother, a housewife and mother to 4 daughters, was thinking about Becky and Amy. She had been relieved after she received a phone call from Amy at about 9:30 p.m., telling her about the flat tire and that 2 nice men were going to give them a ride home. However, when 45 minutes had passed, Tony was worried enough to change out of her pajamas and drive to the convenience store, expecting to see the girls maybe walking home along the road, perhaps not able to get a ride home after all. Tony did not come across the girls, and when she arrived at the convenience store, she found Becky's car, with its flat tire, unlocked. There was no sign of either daughter. Now, very concerned, Tony drove the area neighborhoods for at least 2 more hours until she, at last, called the police. Back in the white Impala, speeding farther and farther away from the convenience store and their home on Glendale Avenue, it had become clear to Becky and Amy that the 2 men who had initially offered their help had in actuality intended harm. The Impala's driver, 29-year-old Jerry Lee Jenkins, an overweight man with greasy blonde hair, had at the time been working on and off at a gas station, and he lived in a cramped apartment with his 18-year-old wife, Darcy, and their 2 young daughters. Shiftless and lazy and usually out of work, the 29-year-old Jenkins often stayed home while Darcy worked minimum wage jobs. It had been Darcy's Impala that Jenkins was driving that night. Since his early teenage years, Jenkins had always been in and out of jail, his charges ranging from public drunkenness to vagrancy, car theft, hit and run, and check forgery. His arrests had also included the intimate assault of a woman, although those charges would ultimately be dropped. Jenkins's passenger in the Impala was 27-year-old Ronald Kennedy, a tall, skinny man with dark, greasy hair and wild bug eyes. He, along with his friends Jenkins, were well known by the Casper police. And like Jenkins, Kennedy had also done multiple stints in prison since his youth. He had stalked and assaulted women numerous times, although that had mostly been out of the police department's knowledge. Notably, Kennedy had been a suspect in the robbery and murder of a 66-year-old male gas station clerk just the year before, in 1972. On this day of Monday, September 24th, 1973, Jenkins and Kennedy had met up in the afternoon to drink beer and cruise the town of Casper looking for trouble. And when they pulled into the Thriftway convenience store lot, hungry and wanting food and cigarettes, trouble had indeed arrived, and now it was looking at Becky and Amy as its victim. It was a crime of opportunity. A couple hours had passed since they had left the convenience store, and Becky and Amy were still in the back seat of the Impala, confused and terrified. Jenkins and Kennedy continued to drink beer as they drove on, telling the girls various stories that they were members of the Hells Angel gang, that they worked for the mafia, and they sold dope in California, and that Becky and Amy were being brought to see a man who wanted to question them about a hit-and-run crime. At one point, Becky made a last-ditch effort and managed to open the passenger door, shoving her feet out of the door in the hopes that a passerby would see and notify the police. No one saw, although the stunt infuriated Kennedy, who turned on Becky enraged, facing both girls in the back seat and alternately punching and slamming Becky's face and stabbing the seat around both their legs. The men drove on until suddenly the car stopped. Becky recognized the road. It was Casper Mountain Road, and she recognized the bridge as well. The Fremont Canyon Bridge was an old 60-foot-long steel bridge built over a remote red stone canyon, located about 30 miles outside of town. The bridge rose a dizzying 120 feet above the water of the North Platte River below, which pooled and flowed among the craggy crevices on the canyon floor. Parked at the end of the bridge in the Impala, Kennedy turned to Amy and told her to get out of the car. He was taking her to meet the man who wanted to question them about a hit-and-run accident. Climbing over Becky in the back seat of the Impala, Amy followed Kennedy into the darkness, eager to just complete this mission and return to the car and her sister. In the meantime, Becky, bruised and bleeding, was held on the floor of the back seat by Jenkins. After a few minutes, Kennedy returned to the car, alone, telling Becky that they were to await a signal, after which Becky would then be taken to her sister, and also taken to see this man. Kennedy climbed into the Impala. Jenkins drove the car, and the car slowly crept forward about 200 yards and parked again. Kennedy was the first to climb into the back seat with Becky. He removed his clothes and hers and assaulted her. And next, Jenkins did the same. Afterward, Becky was allowed to put on her jeans and her sweater. Kennedy and Jenkins told Becky that they were going to meet Amy finally, leading her to the bridge. They got out of the car and walked her over. Of course, by this time, Becky had realized that everything that she had been told were lies. She knew where she was, and she knew what lay below in the darkness. The two men grabbed her and attempted to hoist her over the guardrail, but they were ultimately unable to do so as Becky fought hard to hang on. When Jenkins started to choke her, Becky made the split decision to take her chances with a fall into the river, plummeting toward the gaping blackness of the canyon and the shadowy depths of the river below, 120 feet below. So she let herself fall. As Becky fell from the bridge, her body slammed into the canyon wall and then continued its spiral down. When Becky hit the river and sank into the cold, dark water, it was a shock to her senses, and her natural instinct to survive kicked in. Although she was sure that her legs had been badly injured, Becky made a desperate attempt to swim and to push with her arms toward the surface. As she clawed her way through the water toward the night air, her jeans just simply fell off her body. Becky dragged herself out of the water and crawled to a soft dirt ledge where she waited for daylight under some sagebrush. She heard the voices of her attackers coming from far above on the bridge, and she had no idea if they realized that she was still alive. She also had no idea if her sister Amy was alive. Freezing, injured, and enveloped in darkness at the bottom of the canyon, she could only wait out the long dark hours until the morning sunlight would light her way up and out of the canyon. As soon as she could make out her surroundings, she began the almost impossible ascent toward the road, dragging her useless legs over the steep and rocky ground. She had one purpose. She must live to tell. The next morning, on Tuesday, September 25th, 1973, elderly couple Carl and Dorothy Strasser had arisen early to go fishing. They took their normal route, and as their car approached the Fremont Canyon Bridge, they saw the horrific sight of a bloody and battered girl laying in the road, naked from the waist down, and waving her arms. Her left eye was swollen shut, and she was unable to speak, and unable to walk. When Becky's mom, Toni, arrived at the hospital, she was shocked to see the condition of her battered daughter, yet she was so happy that she couldn't stop hugging her. While the hospital staff cleaned her wounds and looked over her broken body, including the removal of one contact lens from her swollen eye, Becky could finally tell the police investigators the events of the night before. She describes her attackers with vivid detail, including their first names, and she cries when she tells her mother that she feared that Amy was dead. Back at Fremont Canyon, one diver, Fred Klein, had arrived before the rest of the dive search team could, and he had decided that not a moment could be wasted. He lowered himself, with the help of a couple deputies with a rope, into the deep canyon, and he entered the cloudy and green water of the North Platte River, and he began his search. Only 5 minutes into his dive and 30 feet down into the water, Fred finds one small white tennis shoe resting on the bottom. And then, just a few feet further away, he finds the body of 11-year-old Amy Burridge floating face down, limbs spread out, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, one shoe on and one barefoot. Amy's injuries would later be revealed to be a crushed rib cage and a broken spine which had been driven into her brain. It was determined that she had died immediately after her fall, and her small body was then taken to the morgue where her mother, Toni, had to identify her beautiful young daughter. Back at the hospital, police investigator Dave Davala recognized the names and descriptions of the two attackers Becky had described. He knew who they were and where they lived, and now he was on their trail. Investigator David Davala heads to Ronald Kennedy's mother's house, where he was known to be living, and he settles in for a stakeout. However, he soon hears over the police dispatch that both Kennedy and Jenkins had been seen driving in Kennedy's green pickup truck just that morning, and he immediately leaves to begin the chase. Not long later, Davala spotted Kennedy, now alone, driving that green pickup truck. Unable to call for backup and seizing his chance, while Kennedy was parked at a red light, Davala quickly approached the vehicle and apprehended Ronald Kennedy. Later that day, Jerry Lee Jenkins is found at the local liquor store, and he is also arrested. On his body is found the same pocket knife which Kennedy had used the night before to abduct Becky and Amy. Now in custody, both Jenkins and Kennedy are given lawyers, although both men would take different approaches in their defense strategy. Jenkins would choose to confess to his part of the crime, telling the investigators that he and Kennedy had seen the girls in the convenience store parking lot and decided to trick them into leaving in their white Impala. He tells the investigator that Kennedy had slashed the tire of Becky's Ford station wagon, causing it to go flat. It was Kennedy, Jenkins said, who forced the girls into the car. It was Kennedy who beat and tortured them, all while Jenkins just simply drove. Jenkins then goes on to tell the police that yes, he and Kennedy had driven to the bridge, but that he didn't know what happened to Amy. He also does not admit to the assault of Becky. When he describes Becky's fall over the rail of the bridge, he states that he and Kennedy simply pushed her over like a sack of potatoes. Becky was still in the hospital, recovering from her injuries, when Amy Burridge was laid to rest 2 weeks later. At her funeral, friends and family lovingly remembered the 11-year-old's energy, her spirit, and her sweetness. They recalled how Amy was always excited to play sports and hang out with her many friends. They spoke about her bravery and her zest for life. Amy was buried with her hair in pigtails, ribbons matching the colorful hand-embroidered vest which she had often worn in life. The trial of Ronald Kennedy and Jerry Lee Jenkins began 7 months later in April of 1974, and 170 miles away from Casper, in the town of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Becky Thompson, now healed from her physical injuries, would be the state's first witness. On the stand, Becky calmly and bravely recounted the events of the night leading up to the crime. To the packed and silent courtroom, she recalled the question her sister Amy had asked their two abductors, asking, "Sir, can I ask you one question? Are you going to murder us?" In reply, Kennedy had laughed and told Amy that she watched too much TV. In Becky's testimony, she went on to tell the jury the last words she had heard Amy say as she had climbed out over her to exit the car and to go with Kennedy. She had said, "Okay, Becky, I love you." Investigators and medical professionals added further testimony and information during the trial. But the last prosecution witness was the most damning to the defense, placing Becky with the perpetrators on the night of the crime. Optometrist Dr. Leo Bush delivered the crucial evidence that a single contact lens that had been found on the back seat of the white Chevy Impala indeed matched the contact lens which had been removed from Becky's bruised and swollen eye at the hospital. The lens had fallen out in the back seat as a result of her beating, and it served as an irrefutable link between victim and attacker. The trial of Kennedy and Jenkins would end up as Wyoming's first capital murder case in almost 10 years. Kennedy's public defender lawyer attempted to mount an insanity defense for his client, bringing Kennedy's mother, Hilda, to the stand to recount his troubled childhood. And indeed, Ronald Kennedy did come from a horrible early home life, growing up as one of 6 children in an abusive and a very poor household. Ronald's father, an occasional auto mechanic and a full-time drunk, had consistently beat and terrorized his children and his wife, who herself was never able to provide a positive role model for her children. In response, the prosecution pointed out that Kennedy was responsible for his own actions, and they brought to the stand witnesses who attested to his past violent behavior, especially towards women. In the end, the state argued, Ronald Kennedy may have suffered from an antisocial personality and a troubled home life, but he had still known right from wrong. For his part, the defense lawyer for Jerry Lee Jenkins did not dispute the events of that fateful night of the crime. He simply blamed Kennedy for everything. Kennedy had stuck the knife against Becky's side at the convenience store. Kennedy had slashed the tire. Kennedy had punched and slapped the girls in the car. Kennedy had walked off with Amy into the darkness on the bridge. And Kennedy was the one who had drove all the events that night. Kennedy was merely the driver of the car. And if there was to be any excuse of Kennedy's behavior because of his terrible childhood, well, Jenkins could claim that as well. Coming from another rough childhood home, Jenkins had grown up among 3 siblings who were all beaten by their father and ignored by their mother. As a result, he had dropped out of school and he had turned to crime to get by in life. Jenkins's lawyer admitted that his client was an impulsive sociopath, but he had simply followed his friend Kennedy's lead on the night of the crime. Neither defendant took the stand in their own defense. When the trial ended, the jury had only 2 options: In the year 1974, in the state of Wyoming, a first-degree murder trial could only have one of two results: complete acquittal or death. The jury came back with guilty on all counts, and as a result, the judge became the first Wyoming judge to deliver a death sentence in 9 years. Kennedy and Jenkins were subsequently delivered to their cells on death row in the Wyoming State Penitentiary, where they would await their death. However, the delivery of that death sentence would not come. Both Kennedy and Jenkins appealed their death sentences within days of their conviction, and following a lengthy legal battle in 1977, 3 years later, the Wyoming Supreme Court reversed the sentence of death. The murder convictions were upheld, but instead, both men were given life in prison. Jenkins adapted well in prison, content with the routine of life inside. After all, he had been in and out of jail for years. He never attended his parole hearings or strove to be released, dying in prison of a heart attack in 1998 at the age of 54. Ronald Kennedy, on the other hand, was continually conniving, often writing irate letters to his attorneys and to anyone else who would read them. Eventually, he was granted a new attorney, but all his efforts have been fruitless, and he remains in prison to this day. Becky Thompson eventually recovered from the physical injuries brought upon by her attack, but her emotional wounds were much deeper. Becky would continue to live in Casper and turn to drinking to find comfort and to cope with her pain from the murder of her sister. She drifted in and out of jobs, ultimately finding success as a saleswoman for a radio station. But the good times never lasted. Becky also began smoking marijuana and relying on taking antidepressants in addition to alcohol, and the combination of those three landed her in rehab. Eventually, Becky married Russ, a nice guy who was well liked by her family and friends. With her stepfather away on business, Dave Davala, the detective who had arrested Ron Kennedy, stepped in the role of father of the bride, walking Becky down the aisle. Their relationship had grown to be a special one over the years, and they would keep in close touch, although they never did talk about the crime. Becky and Russ's marriage began to decline soon after the wedding, with both the newlyweds perhaps not ready for the marriage. They still held on, and after 3 years, they welcomed the arrival of a baby girl in 1990. Becky loved being a mother, and she vowed to give her the life that her sister Amy had never got to live. Unfortunately, the birth of their daughter was not enough to save their marriage, and Becky and Russ divorced. Russ requested a divorce just 6 months after the baby's arrival. In the year that followed, the stressors in Becky's life only increased. She was now a single mother with a demanding sales job in which she had begun to falter. She had started a relationship with a new man who wasn't a great fit in her life, and she always lived with the fear that someday, somehow, her attackers would be released from prison and that they would come back to finish what they were unable to accomplish on the night of September 25th, 1973. In 1992, Becky was 37 years old and making a great attempt to battle her addictions, attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and staying in touch with her now sober friends from her teenage days. However, she felt an overwhelming amount of survivor's guilt, telling her friends it was she who should have died that September night in 1973 instead of her sister Amy. Despite her best efforts, depression weighed heavily on Becky, and her self-medication of antidepressants and alcohol continued. She felt a darkness which had never lifted, even as the first light of morning had finally touched the bottom of Fremont Canyon. It was a darkness, a constant in Becky's life from that night on, and it just threatened to consume her. On July 31st, 1992, Becky hit another low point in her life. Yet another one. She had been unable to break up with her boyfriend. Her work was sliding, and worst of all, her addictions were overtaking her. She had reached out to a couple friends that morning, but by the time they called her back, Becky was unreachable. Becky had left work early that day, buying a new dress at the mall and eating a late lunch. She and her boyfriend picked up her 2-year-old daughter from the babysitter, and they stopped to purchase a 6-pack of beer. They were aimlessly driving, and Becky's despondency grew worse and darker with every mile and with each beer she drank. Suddenly, she announced to her boyfriend where they should go: the Fremont Canyon Bridge. Despite her boyfriend's concerns, Becky seemed to be on a mission, speeding to the very place which held her darkest memories and had hung over her the last 19 years of her life. When they arrived, Becky parked and walked to the bridge's guardrail, peering over into the deepening evening gloom of the canyon, with her boyfriend and her daughter beside her, and with a dark attention to detail. Becky began to point out the spots which the investigators had detailed both her descent and Amy's. She pointed to the scrub brush under which she had hid and waited for the morning light to come 19 years ago, although whether the light ever did really appear for Becky is debatable. After a few moments, Becky started to cry, and when her daughter began to cry in response, Becky's boyfriend took the little girl back to the car, leaving Becky sitting and dangling her legs over the North Platte River far below. As Becky's boyfriend was attending to the little girl, he heard a sudden loud splash, and when he looked toward the bridge where Becky had been sitting, it was now empty. She was gone. Former investigator and current sheriff, and the man who had once walked her down the wedding aisle, Dave Davala, was called to the scene. Emergency personnel confirmed his worst fear. Becky had been killed upon impact at the bottom of the very canyon from which she had escaped a lifetime ago. In the years that followed, Becky's family would never be sure of what was exactly going through Becky's mind on that fateful day, and whether her death was accidental or intentional. Did she simply lean forward too far? Did she wish to die and jump with purpose? Did the effect of the alcohol and the pills and her low mood muddy her mind and push her toward a great mistake? It's true that the cause of her death was listed as undetermined on her death certificate, but those close to Becky knew the true cause, the real cause. Becky had, in fact, already died. On the very same night as her little spitfire of a sister, the brave and baseball-loving Amy Burridge. It had just taken 19 years longer for Becky's life to end. Becky was buried with her sister, and now they both rest at peace, together again. Thank you for watching this true crime video. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. It was my honor to tell the story of Becky Thompson and Amy Burridge, and may their memory bless all those who loved and cared for them. Until next time, please take care.